Hello and welcome. You stand at the edge of one of the greatest tragedies in the history of Phaerimm, a moment when the sky itself shattered and cities of wonder fell like broken stars. The Fall of Netheril was not merely the end of an empire, it was the death of an age, the silencing of thousands of voices, and the severing of humanity's greatest reach toward the divine. When you speak of Netheril, you speak of ambition without boundary, of magic wielded with such mastery that the very gods took notice, and of a single spell that brought it all crashing down in fire and ruin. The Empire of Netheril existed for over 3,000 years, rising from humble beginnings to become the most magically advanced civilization that humans have ever created on Toril. At its height, entire cities floated among the clouds, held aloft by magic so powerful and so refined that gravity itself became optional. The arcanists of Netheril did not simply study magic. They rewrote its rules, pushed its boundaries, and believed themselves capable of anything. Historical records suggest they created spells of the 10th and 11th circles, magic so potent that it would later be banned by the goddess of magic herself. They crafted artifacts that would endure for millennia. They explored distant planes and bargained with beings of immense power. Evidence indicates they lived lives that stretched across centuries, defying death itself through magical means. But every height has its fall, and Netheril's descent was absolute. To understand the catastrophe that befell Netheril in the year -339 Dale reckoning, you must first understand what Netheril was, how it rose, and why its arcanists believed they could touch the face of divinity itself. You must walk through the centuries of achievement and innovation, see the wonders they created, and comprehend the slow poison of hubris that infected their hearts. Only then can you truly grasp the magnitude of what was lost when Karsus, the greatest and most foolish of all Netheril's arcanists, cast a spell that should never have been spoken. The story begins not with floating cities or godlike wizards, but with a discovery that would change everything. Long before Netheril earned its name, long before the first enclave lifted into the sky, there existed scattered tribes of humans dwelling in the lands that would one day become the Empire. These were the Netherese people, and they took their name from the Nether Mountains that dominated their homeland in what would much later be called the northern reaches of Phaerimm. The historical accounts that survive describe them as unremarkable among the peoples of ancient Toril. They dwelt in fishing villages along the shores of what they called the Narrow Sea, living simple lives sustained by the bounty of the waters and the land. They hunted game in the forests, gathered what they could from the wild places, and built modest settlements of wood and stone. These early Netheres practiced magic, but only in its most primitive forms, based on the fragmentary records that remain. A village shaman might coax a flame to life with a gesture, or speak words that would ease the pain of a wound. These were simple expressions of magical power, requiring more time and concentration than true skill. Magic was rare, difficult, and regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The people respected those who could wield it, but they did not expect it to transform their lives. Then came contact with the elves, and the trajectory of Netheril's civilization shifted fundamentally. The elven people, whose civilizations had flourished for thousands of years before human settlements appeared, established trade relationships with the Netheril's villages. They brought goods of exquisite craftsmanship, and most importantly, they brought magical instruction. The elves taught the humans more sophisticated applications of magic, moving beyond simple techniques into true spellcraft. According to the histories, a young man named Phaerimm became one of the first Netheril's to truly master this art under elven tutelage. The accounts suggest he progressed rapidly, earning recognition within his community as the earliest true arcanist of what would become Netheril. For roughly a century, trade with the elves continued, and magical knowledge spread through Netheril's society. Unlike many other human cultures, the Netheril's embraced magic as something essential, something that could be widely taught rather than restricted to a gifted few. This universal approach to magical education would prove to be one of their defining characteristics and greatest strengths. The population grew, the villages expanded into towns, and the Netheril's began to explore the world around them with increasing confidence. But it was a discovery in ancient ruins that would truly transform the Netheril's from a people who used magic into a people who would redefine it. The exact date varies slightly between sources, but most historians place the discovery of the Nether Scrolls around -3100 and 63 Dale Reckoning. Netheril's explorers found ancient ruins in what the records call the Far Horns Forest, remnants of a civilization that had fallen long before human memory. The most commonly cited account mentions that these were the ruins of Aravendar, an ancient elven empire destroyed in wars of terrible magnitude. Among the shattered stones and crumbling walls, the explorers found golden scroll cases, perfectly preserved despite the passage of uncounted centuries, and within those cases lay scrolls inscribed with magical formulae of breathtaking complexity. These were the Nether Scrolls, and they represented knowledge far beyond anything previously available to humanity. The origin of the Nether Scrolls remains disputed among scholars. Some believe they were created by the creator races, the ancient beings who shaped Toril in its earliest ages. Others suggest they were the work of beings even older, though concrete evidence for either theory is scarce. What the historical record does confirm is that the scrolls contained magical knowledge far beyond what the elves had taught, and that somehow the Netheril's learned to read and understand them, whether this was due to their century of magical education preparing them, or whether the scrolls themselves contained some quality that made their contents accessible, remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the Netheril's could interpret the Nether Scrolls, and what they learned changed them forever. The scrolls revealed fundamental principles of the weave itself, the underlying structure of magic that permeates all reality. They contained spells of extraordinary sophistication and magical techniques that went far beyond anything previously known. Based on later Netherese achievements, we can infer that the scrolls explained how to manipulate magical energy with precision and efficiency, how to craft enchantments that would endure for centuries, and how to reach into other planes of existence. The Nether Scrolls were not simply a collection of spells, but rather a comprehensive education in arcane theory, and the Netherese devoted themselves to studying them with extraordinary intensity. This discovery marked what Netherese historians would later call the beginning of the Nether Age. It sparked a magical revolution that would transform their society across generations. Within relatively short periods, the Netherese went from being competent practitioners of basic magic to becoming some of the most skilled arcanists on Toril. The historical records credit them with developing numerous magical innovations, including the creation of ion stones, magical gems that orbit their user's head and provide various enhancements. According to the chronicles, an arcanist named Congenio Ion created these devices and lived for over 900 years through magical life extension. When he finally died, the records suggest he was mourned as a hero whose achievements had proven the potential the Nether Scrolls had unlocked. Whether all the specific details about Congenio are historically accurate or have been embellished by later accounts is difficult to verify. But his existence and the creation of ion stones are well-established facts. The settlements grew into cities as the population increased and magical capabilities expanded. These cities spread across the land, each one becoming a center of learning and power. This network of earthbound cities formed what would be known as Low Netheril, the foundation of the empire. The Netherese established relationships with other peoples, including the dwarves of Delzone, with whom they developed extensive trade. The cities of Low Netheril grew ever more magnificent as the centuries passed. Based on archaeological evidence and later accounts, buildings incorporated permanent magical enhancements. Streets featured sophisticated enchantments, and the Netherese standard of living rose far above that of other contemporary civilizations. The Netherese continued to develop increasingly powerful magic over the centuries. They progressed through higher circles of spellcasting, each new level opening possibilities that had seemed impossible before. The historical record becomes somewhat fragmentary regarding the specific pace of this advancement, but it's clear that by the time they approached the height of their civilization, Netherese arcanists were working with magic of extraordinary power. Some arcanists began to pursue an ambition that would define the next era of Netheril. They sought to create cities that did not merely stand upon the earth, but floated above it, free from the constraints of gravity itself. The arcanist who would achieve this breakthrough was named Iulaum. The historical sources credit him as both a military leader who defended Netheril against external threats and a magical innovator of exceptional skill. Whether he conceived the idea of floating cities independently or built upon earlier research is unclear from surviving records, but he was undeniably the one who made it reality. Records indicate that in the year -1868 Dale Reckoning, Iulaum successfully created the first floating enclave. The specifics of how he accomplished this feat have been lost to history, buried with Netheril itself. What is documented is the result. He took a portion of a city, buildings and streets and people and all, and lifted it into the sky through magical force. The enclave bore his name and was held aloft by a mythaller, a massive magical device that generated power on an unprecedented scale. The mythaller did not simply levitate the enclave, but sustained it completely, providing power for all the city's needs and making life among the clouds not just possible, but comfortable. The creation of Iulaum's enclave marked what historians call the beginning of the Silver Age. It represented what many considered the pinnacle of magical achievement. Almost immediately, other arcanists began working to replicate Iulaum's success. Within what the fragmentary records suggest were relatively few decades, multiple floating enclaves drifted through the skies above low Netheril. These enclaves became known collectively as High Netheril, representing what was seen as the absolute pinnacle of magical civilization. The historical sources indicate that life within these floating cities was unlike anything experienced elsewhere in Phaerimm. To live in a floating enclave was to exist surrounded by luxuries and marvels that ground-bound people could scarcely imagine. Each enclave was unique, shaped by the vision and personality of the arcanist who created it. Some were cities of gleaming towers and gardens. Others were fortresses bristling with magical defenses. Still others were centers of learning, great libraries, and colleges where scholars gathered. Based on the accounts that survive and the archaeological evidence from the ruins, we can infer that daily life in High Netheril involved extraordinary magical convenience. Buildings likely maintained themselves through enchantment. Food could be created through magic rather than grown in fields. Any physical need could be addressed through proper application of spells. The residents of the enclaves looked down, quite literally, upon the people of low Netheril, and evidence suggests a significant cultural divide grew between those who walked the earth and those who sailed the heavens. Yet for all their power and all their achievement, the Netherese were not without enemies. Beneath the surface, in the deep places of the earth, dwelt creatures that would become their nemesis. Section 2. The Golden Age and Creeping Shadows. Historical sources mark the beginning of what Netheril called its Golden Age, with various dates, though many scholars point to the period when new magical innovations accelerated dramatically. This was the era when the floating enclaves multiplied across the skies, when arcanists pushed magic toward what they believed were its ultimate limits, and when the Netherese truly came to see themselves as masters of reality. Records suggest they were creating new enclaves at a remarkable rate, each one a monument to magical achievement. The skies above Netheril became increasingly populated with floating cities. If you had stood on the ground in low Netheril during this period and looked upward, the accounts suggest you would have witnessed an extraordinary sight. Enclaves gleamed in the sunlight, suspended impossibly in the air. Some were vast, sprawling cities that stretched for considerable distances, their buildings rising in towers that reached toward the clouds. Others were smaller, more intimate domains created by arcanists who valued privacy over grandeur. Each enclave was utterly unique, shaped by the resources, aesthetics, and priorities of its creator. The fragmentary records that describe specific enclaves provide some fascinating details. The enclave of Opus, for instance, is described in later accounts as a city designed around musical principles, though the exact details of how this manifested are somewhat unclear. The enclave of Doubloon apparently functioned as a major trading hub, a floating marketplace where merchants came to conduct business. The enclave of Anoria, which would later be among those saved from the fall, was noted for its libraries and repositories of knowledge. What can we infer about daily life within these floating cities, based on what we know of Netheryl's magical capabilities and the accounts that survived? Life in High Netheril likely involved constant magical enhancement. Surviving magical items from Netheril demonstrate their sophistication with enchantments that maintain themselves indefinitely. This suggests that buildings in the enclaves probably featured similar permanent magic. The Netherese clearly had mastered food creation through conjuration and transmutation. Given that the enclaves had no farmland, historical sources confirm that High Netheril arcanists extended their lifespans through magic, living for centuries rather than mere decades. The evidence indicates that a significant cultural gap developed between High and Low Netheril. The floating cities were self-sufficient, not dependent on the ground below for resources. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that those who achieved residence in the enclaves often viewed ground dwellers as inferior. This apparent elitism would have serious consequences as Low Netheril faced mounting crises. Because beneath the sands, ancient enemies were stirring. The Phaerimm were aberrations, creatures of such alien nature that they seemed fundamentally wrong. Surviving descriptions portray them as having roughly conical bodies, powerful limbs, and multiple mouths lined with sharp teeth. They floated naturally and possessed innate magical abilities of considerable power. Most significantly for Netheril, they fed upon magical energy itself, draining it from the land, from objects, and from living beings. The historical record indicates that the Phaerimm had dwelt in their subterranean realm for considerable time before coming into conflict with Netheril. As the empire grew and magical activity increased, residue apparently began seeping into the earth. The sources suggest this caused the Phaerimm significant distress, though interpreting their motivations is speculative at best. What is clear from the historical record is that eventually they retaliated. Different sources provide varying dates for when the Phaerimm began their attacks on Netheril. One commonly cited timeframe places their initial aggression around -461 Dale reckoning. The Phaerimm's approach was insidious rather than direct military confrontation. They cast spells that drained life from the land itself, pulling vitality from the soil and vegetation. Wherever these enchantments took hold, the earth began dying. Plants withered, water sources dried up, and fertile ground transformed into sand and dust. The historical accounts suggest the Netherese did not immediately understand what was occurring. They noticed agricultural decline and unusual environmental changes, but attributing these to an enemy's deliberate action apparently took time. By the point they realized the truth, significant damage had already occurred across considerable territory. The Phaerimm also discovered they could target the Mythalers, powering the floating enclaves. These massive magical devices, generating constant streams of energy to keep cities aloft, were apparently detectable to creatures that fed on magic. The historical record confirms that the Phaerimm destroyed at least 2 enclaves early in the conflict, Layada and Tylandrothil, causing them to fall from the sky. The impacts would have been catastrophic, killing thousands and leaving craters that served as grim evidence of the threat the aberrations posed. These attacks finally spurred the Netherese to organized military response. The sources indicate they developed new spells specifically designed to combat the Phaerimm magic that could overcome the creature's natural magical resistances. They erected protective wards around the Mythalers, making them more difficult to disrupt. Perhaps most significantly, they launched expeditions into the Underdark, bringing the fight directly to the Phaerimm's territory. The war that followed raged for centuries, a grinding conflict fought primarily in the darkness beneath Netheril. From what the historical record suggests, Netherese arcanists became specialists in subterranean combat, developing tactics and magic suited to fighting in the twisting passages of the Underdark. They apparently killed large numbers of Phaerimm, driving them deeper underground. But they could not eliminate the threat entirely. And more critically, they could not undo the environmental damage already inflicted. The desertification continued to spread inexorably. By the middle centuries of what should have been Netheril's golden age, the effects had become severe enough to force large-scale population movements. Communities that had existed for centuries found themselves surrounded by expanding wasteland. Cities that had once been prosperous found their water sources failing and their agricultural base collapsing. The migration patterns suggested by the historical record indicate significant westward movement as people fled the dying land. This expanding desert came to be called Anarok, and it would eventually consume most of what had been Netheril's heartland. Where forests and farmland had once existed, only sand and rock remained. The transformation represented a slow-motion apocalypse, a catastrophe that unfolded across generations, rather than in a single cataclysmic moment. Meanwhile, the historical sources suggest that the arcanists of High Netheril largely remained detached from these surface world problems. Their enclaves didn't require fertile soil or flowing rivers. Food came from conjuration, water from magical creation. Some accounts mention individual arcanists descending to offer aid, creating temporary magical solutions like enchanted wells or oases. But these were evidently stopgap measures that didn't address the fundamental crisis. The disconnect between High and Low Netheril appears to have widened during this period, based on the patterns that emerge from various historical accounts. Resentment likely built among ground dwellers, as those above seemed indifferent to their suffering. The empire was fracturing, not through open conflict, but through growing social division and the literal death of the land beneath it. Yet even as these crises mounted, the arcanists of High Netheril continued pushing magical boundaries. The evidence indicates they developed spells of the Ninth Circle, representing power that could reshape reality on significant scales. But this apparently wasn't enough. The competitive culture of High Netheril, as suggested by later accounts, drove constant escalation. Each arcanist sought to outdo rivals, to create something more impressive, more powerful, more unprecedented. Records confirm they eventually developed 10th Circle magic, spells that pushed against the fundamental limits of what the weave could sustain. These were workings that could affect entire regions, that could reach across planar boundaries, that represented power approaching the divine. The historical sources indicate that some arcanists even began developing 11th Circle spells, though concrete details about this magic are scarce given what happened later. The arcanists of High Netheril had entered what we might call a feedback loop of escalating ambition. Their culture rewarded achievement and innovation. Their magic kept removing obstacles and solving problems. They had extended their lifespans, created floating cities, developed spells of extraordinary power. From their perspective, every previous impossible challenge had fallen before sufficient magical force. This pattern of success appears to have bred a dangerous conviction that there truly were no limits they needed to respect, no boundaries that should constrain them. The historical record suggests this mindset permeated High Netheril during the later centuries of the Golden Age. Individual caution gave way to collective hubris. The question shifted from "should we do this?" to "how can we do this?" Magical research that earlier generations might have considered too dangerous now proceeded with minimal restraint. And into this environment of escalating ambition and declining caution would be born the arcanist who would end everything. His genius would be undeniable, his power unprecedented, and his folly absolute. His name was Karsus, And understanding who he was and what drove him requires looking beyond simple vilification to examine the culture that produced him and the crisis that shaped his thinking. Section 3. Karsus, the Arcanist of Ambition. The situation facing Netheril by the middle centuries of what should have been its golden age had deteriorated dramatically. The desert of Anarok had consumed vast territories that had once sustained the empire's population. The Phaerimm continued their assault despite centuries of warfare, and the Netherese had failed to eliminate the threat decisively. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were being abandoned as the land around them died. Refugees moved in constant streams westward, seeking territories not yet touched by the spreading devastation. Low Netheril was collapsing under the combined weight of environmental catastrophe and military pressure. The ground-bound cities that had once formed the empire's foundation were failing one by one. Civil unrest had become endemic as people competed for dwindling resources. The Arcanists who remained in Low Netheril struggled to maintain order, though their numbers declined as more chose to flee or seek refuge in the floating enclaves. High Netheril remained physically untouched by the devastation below, the floating cities continuing their serene drift through the clouds. But even among the enclaves, evidence suggests there was growing unease. The Phaerimm had proven capable of targeting Mythalers and bringing down cities. The war showed no signs of ending. Despite all their power, the Netherese seemed unable to achieve final victory. Into this crisis was born the child who would become the most powerful Arcanist Netheril ever produced, and whose actions would end everything. The historical record indicates that Karsus was born in the year -696 Dale reckoning, though some sources cite slightly different dates. What is consistently documented is that he entered the world in the enclave that bore his family's name, and that from his earliest years, his magical talent was extraordinary. The accounts that survive describe manifestations of power unusual, even by Netherese standards, suggesting he possessed innate abilities far beyond normal human capacity. Details about Karsus's childhood are fragmentary, and we must be cautious about separating historical fact from later embellishment. What seems clear from multiple sources is that he progressed through magical education with remarkable speed. Where typical students spent years mastering each level of spellcasting, Karsus apparently advanced far more rapidly. The historical consensus suggests that by adulthood, he had already surpassed many of his teachers and begun developing original magical theories. The records indicate that Karsus achieved mastery of Ninth Circle magic at an unusually young age, though the exact time frame varies between sources. What is consistently documented is that he created multiple new spells, developed innovative magical theories, and attracted other accomplished arcanists to study with him or collaborate on research. His enclave became recognized as a center of magical innovation. But ninth circle magic, despite representing power that could devastate armies or reshape landscapes, was apparently insufficient from Karsus's perspective. Based on the evidence of what he eventually created, it seems clear he believed existing magic was inadequate to solve the crisis facing Netheril. The Phaerimm threatened the Empire's survival. The desert continued to spread. Conventional approaches had failed for centuries. What Netheril needed, he appears to have concluded, was a fundamental leap beyond existing magical limitations. The historical record confirms that Karsus developed magic beyond the ninth circle, whether he progressed through 10th circle first, then 11th, or pursued multiple levels of research simultaneously is unclear from surviving sources. What is documented is that he eventually created what the sources describe as 12th level magic, representing power that touched on forces mortals were never meant to wield. The terminology here requires clarification. Different historical sources use circle, level, and other terms somewhat interchangeably when discussing Netherese magic. Modern magical practice recognizes 9 levels of spells. Karsus's achievement was developing magic beyond this framework, regardless of the exact terminology used to describe it. The specific spell that would define Karsus's legacy was called Karsus's Avatar, and the historical sources are clear about its intended function. It was designed to allow a mortal to steal the divine power of a god. The audacity of this goal cannot be overstated. No mortal had ever successfully claimed divine power. The very concept challenged fundamental assumptions about the separation between mortal and divine realms. Why would Karsus pursue such an extreme approach? Based on what we know of Netheril's situation and Karsus's documented abilities, we can infer his reasoning. The gods wielded power that dwarfed mortal magic. If he could temporarily claim that power, he could potentially solve problems that had proven intractable through conventional means. He could destroy the Phaerimm utterly, restore life to Anarok, ensure the floating enclaves would never fall. From his perspective, this may have seemed like the logical solution to an otherwise insoluble crisis. The sources indicate that selecting a target deity required considerable deliberation. Karsus needed to choose carefully, balancing the power he required against the risks of divine retaliation. The historical record confirms that he ultimately chose Mistral, the goddess of magic itself. The logic of this choice, as best we can reconstruct it, seems to have centered on the weave. Mistral controlled the underlying structure through which all magic flowed. If Karsus could claim her power, he would have absolute authority over magic throughout the world. He could theoretically reshape the weave to better serve Netheril's needs, enhance Nethere's magical capabilities, while diminishing those of enemies. Since the Phaerimm relied heavily on magic, controlling the weave could potentially neutralize them completely. What this reasoning failed to account for was the true nature of Mistral's role. The historical sources and later theological understanding make clear that Mistral wasn't simply wielding power over the weave, but actively maintaining it. This was not a task that could be temporarily assumed or handed off. It required constant divine attention and power beyond mortal capacity. But whether Karsus understood this limitation is unclear from the evidence. The sources indicate that developing Karsus's avatar required years of research. The spell's complexity apparently exceeded anything previously attempted. Later accounts suggest the casting would require approximately 6 hours of continuous concentration and tremendous magical energy expenditure. Though we should note this specific detail comes from sources compiled long after the events and may not be entirely accurate. What is consistently documented is that Karsus prepared extensively. He gathered rare components, conducted detailed calculations, and refined the spell's structure through repeated theoretical analysis. Whether he consulted with other arcanists about the project is unclear. Some accounts suggest he worked in relative secrecy, though this may be later interpretation rather than documented fact. The sources that describe Karsus during this period often portray him as increasingly obsessed with his work. These characterizations should be viewed cautiously, as they were written long after his death, often by authors with particular perspectives on the Fall. What seems less debatable is that he was committed to the project and convinced it represented Netheril's best hope for survival. The date when Karsus deemed his spell ready is well documented. The year -339 Dale Reckoning. This date would become one of the most significant in Phaerimm's history, marking the day the world changed forever. According to the accounts that survive, Karsus performed the casting in his own enclave. The specific time of day varies between sources, though many place it during morning hours. What is consistently described is that the spell required extended casting time and generated visible magical effects as power accumulated. The sources describe Karsus speaking words of the spell, making intricate gestures, weaving magical energy into patterns of extraordinary complexity. Magical currents became visible in the air around him. Objects began to levitate. The room filled with light and power. For hours, this continued, building toward the moment of culmination. Arcanists throughout Netheril apparently sensed that something unprecedented was occurring. The historical record mentions disturbances in the weave detectable to those sensitive to magical fluctuations. Some attempted to determine the source, but the magic involved apparently exceeded their ability to comprehend. When Karsus spoke the final words of his spell, the historical sources agree on what happened next. The spell worked, at least initially. Karsus felt Mistral's power flow into him, divine energy entering mortal flesh. For a brief moment, he achieved what he had attempted. He became, in essence, a god. He touched the weave itself, sensing magical activity throughout the world. He had done the impossible, and in that same moment, the sources indicate, he realized something was catastrophically wrong. The power was too vast for mortal consciousness to process. More critically, he found himself suddenly responsible for maintaining the weave, a task requiring divine capabilities he did not possess. The historical accounts suggest he tried desperately to hold the structure together, but he was failing. The weave began to unravel as his control faltered. What Karsus experienced in those final moments is, necessarily, somewhat speculative. The sources describe realization of error, desperate attempts to reverse what he had done, and ultimate failure. Whether these descriptions reflect historical truth or later interpretation is impossible to verify completely. What is documented beyond dispute is the consequence of his spell. Throughout Netheril, throughout the world, magic began to fail catastrophically. Section 4. The Folly and the Fall. Arcanists across Netheril experienced it first as a profound disturbance in the weave, a wrongness that manifested as both physical sensation and intuitive dread. Those in the middle of casting spells found their magic failing in ways that should have been impossible. The carefully structured flows of energy they had learned to manipulate over years of study simply stopped responding properly. Some spells dissipated harmlessly. Others produced wildly unpredictable effects far removed from their intended purposes. Throughout the floating enclaves of High Netheril, warning systems apparently activated as the Mythalers detected the disturbances. Based on what we know of Mythaler operation, specialists would have rushed to their stations, attempting to diagnose and correct whatever was causing the fluctuations. But the sources suggest they could find no localized cause. The problem was not with individual Mythalers, but with the weave itself, and that realization must have been terrifying. In his enclave, historical accounts describe Karsus at the center of forces he could no longer control. Divine power burning through mortal flesh, never meant to contain it. The sources indicate he could feel Mistril's divine consciousness fragmenting under the impossible strain. He could sense the weave collapsing as her attention was torn away from maintaining it. He tried to take over that maintenance, the accounts suggest, but the task exceeded his capabilities by orders of magnitude. According to the historical record, Karsus realized in those moments that he had not saved Netheril, but doomed it. The floating cities would fall not because the Phaerimm attacked them, but because he had broken the fundamental structure of magic itself. Mistril, in what the sources describe as her final moments as that incarnation of divinity, made a choice that would echo through history. She apparently could not reclaim her power while Karsus's spell remained in effect. But she could sacrifice herself, allowing her divine essence to die and be reborn. In that death and rebirth, she could sever the connection Karsus had forged. The goddess of magic died. What happened next is documented in multiple historical sources with remarkable consistency. For a period of time, magic ceased to exist throughout Toril. The weave, the fundamental structure through which arcane power flows, simply vanished. Every spell being cast failed instantly, every magical item went dormant. Every enchantment, from the mightiest artifact to the simplest permanent effect, stopped functioning. The world became temporarily a place without magic. The exact duration of this magical void is somewhat unclear from the sources. Some accounts suggest it lasted several minutes. Others imply a briefer period. What is consistently documented is the consequence for High Netheril. The floating cities began to fall. The physical process would have been inexorable. The mythalers that had held enclaves aloft for centuries suddenly went inert, their power completely cut off. Without the constant magical force sustaining them, the floating cities became subject, once again, to gravity. Structures designed to exist in the sky, never meant to bear their own weight normally, began dropping toward the earth below. The historical record confirms that numerous enclaves fell during this catastrophe. Specific names documented in various sources include Zinlinal, Opus, Doubloon, Conch, Delacqua, and Delia, among others. The exact total number of cities that fell varies between sources, suggesting either incomplete records or differing definitions of what constituted a separate enclave. The accounts that describe the impacts emphasize their catastrophic nature. Cities striking the earth at terminal velocity created forces comparable to meteor strikes. The impacts generated craters that would remain visible for millennia. Shockwaves radiated outward, causing destruction far beyond the immediate crash sites. Debris scattered across vast areas. The mythalers, massive crystalline devices containing enormous magical energy, apparently exploded on impact in at least some cases, though whether this was universal is unclear from the sources. The death toll from the falling cities must have been staggering, though precise numbers are impossible to determine from surviving records. Each enclave housed hundreds or thousands of people. Most of these cities fell, and the historical sources suggest few, if any, occupants survived the impacts. Tens of thousands died in minutes, perhaps more. The enclave of Iulaum, the first of the floating cities, apparently fell empty. Sources indicate its creator had abandoned it before the catastrophe, though the reasons remain unclear. The city crashed into the desert, creating a crater that would eventually become a lake. The ruins of Iulaum would remain there for thousands of years. Crucially, the historical record documents that not all enclaves fell. In the moment of divine death and rebirth, as Mistral transformed into Mistra, the goddess apparently acted to save what she could. 3 enclaves that were falling received divine intervention that slowed their descent and allowed them to land safely. The 3 cities saved are consistently identified across sources as Anoria, Asram, and H-Londeth. These enclaves touched down with their structures intact and their populations alive, though undoubtedly traumatized. They landed in different territories. Anoria in what would become the border kingdoms, Asram near what would become H-Londeth, and H-Londeth in the region that would bear its name. 3 cities saved out of dozens meant that the vast majority were lost. The accumulated knowledge of centuries vanished as libraries burned or were buried. Artifacts of tremendous power were destroyed or scattered. Entire lineages were wiped out. High Netheril, representing 3,000 years of magical development culminating in the floating cities, effectively ceased to exist. Meanwhile, Karsus experienced the end of his brief godhood in what the sources describe as the most terrible way possible. When Mistral died and was reborn as Mistra, the connection between Karsus and divine power was severed. The accounts indicate that the immense energy that had been flowing through him suddenly cut off, returning him to merely mortal status. But his mortal form had been catastrophically damaged by forces it was never meant to contain. The sources describe him as dying, with just enough awareness remaining to comprehend what he had done. According to the historical record, Karsus's body underwent petrification, turning to stone as the last traces of divine magic left him. The process apparently began at his extremities and worked inward toward vital organs. The sources describe this happening over a brief period, suggesting he remained conscious through at least part of the transformation. The accounts state that Karsus wept in his final moments, though interpreting the emotional content of those tears is necessarily speculative. When the petrification reached his heart, he died, becoming a stone statue. The enclave bearing his name fell with the others, but the statue apparently survived the impact, protected by lingering magic, or perhaps preserved deliberately by divine will. The immediate aftermath in Low Netheril was chaotic. Survivors found themselves in a dying land with no help coming from the enclaves above. Because those enclaves no longer existed, cities already struggling with refugee populations from the expanding desert now faced massive influxes from the fallen enclaves. Those who escaped the falling cities arrived with nothing, having lost everything in the catastrophe. The sources indicate that food became desperately scarce almost immediately. Farms already stressed by desertification now needed to feed vastly larger populations. Water sources adequate for existing populations were overwhelmed. Disease spread through overcrowded cities. Civil order collapsed in many locations as desperate people fought over resources. The Phaerimm, apparently sensing their enemy's weakness, intensified their attacks. The Netherese no longer had the strength or organization to mount effective resistance. The war that had raged for centuries was effectively over, won by the Phaerimm through their enemy's self-destruction. Some Netherese attempted to flee westward, joining migrations that now became floods of desperate refugees. They traveled in large groups for safety, carrying what possessions they could salvage. The sources suggest many died during these journeys from hunger, thirst, or attacks by various threats. Those who survived often found themselves unwelcome in other lands. A group of Netherese arcanists, led by someone the sources identify as Ramark, had apparently anticipated, or at least recognized warning signs of impending catastrophe. They gathered followers and a fleet of skyships, vessels capable of magical flight independent of mythalers. When the fall came, they were already departing, heading south toward territories that would become Halriwa. They would establish a new nation there, one founded on Netheri's magical principles, but shaped by lessons learned from the catastrophe. Another group made a different choice. The residents of the enclave of Thultanthar, recognizing imminent disaster, cast a desperate spell that shifted their entire city into the Shadowfell, the plane of shadow. The transition was apparently traumatic, and the shadow energy of their new realm began transforming them into what would be called the Shadowvar. But they survived the fall and would remain in the Shadowfell for approximately 1,777 years before returning. The dwarves of a score opened their halls to Netheri's refugees, honoring old trade relationships. Thousands of humans found shelter in underground strongholds, living alongside the dwarves while they tried to rebuild their lives. Some Netheries fled into the Underdark itself, descending into eternal darkness to escape surface catastrophe. They founded settlements in the deep places, including a city called Philok. Life in the Underdark was harsh and dangerous, but it was survival. Mystra, newly ascended to replace Mistral, took action to prevent any repetition of the catastrophe. She instituted what became known as the Ban of Karsus, a divine decree forbidding the creation or casting of any spell above the 10th level. No mortal would ever again be permitted to wield magic at the 11th or 12th levels that Karsus had developed. The goddess also placed restrictions on certain types of magic, particularly those that could directly affect deities or the weave itself. The world had fundamentally changed. Netheril, which had stood for over 3,000 years and achieved magical wonders unequaled before or since, was gone. Its people were scattered across Phaerimm as refugees. Its cities lay in ruins. The desert of Anarok swallowed the last remnants of what had been the Empire's heartland. The Fall of Netheril was complete. Section 5. Survivors and Scattered Remnants. The survivors who emerged from the wreckage of Netheril found themselves in a world transformed beyond recognition, where once an empire of unparalleled magical achievement had stood. Now only devastation remained. The landscape bore visible scars from the catastrophe, marked by craters where floating cities had impacted the earth, and littered with debris from structures that had once touched the clouds. Based on accounts that described the aftermath, smoke apparently rose from numerous fires, and dust thick enough to obscure the sky hung in the air. The three enclaves that Mystra had saved, Anoria, Asram, and H. Londeth, found themselves in circumstances both fortunate and difficult. They had survived the fall with their structures intact and their populations alive. But they were no longer the floating paradises they had been. They were grounded permanently, their mythalers depleted or fundamentally altered by the divine intervention that had saved them. The historical accounts suggest that residents emerged in shock, stepping onto streets that now rested on solid ground rather than empty air. Anoria had come to rest in lands that would become the border kingdoms. Far from Netheril's former heartland, the sources indicate that the city's residents attempted to establish themselves as a new nation, drawing on their magical knowledge and Netheri's heritage. But the trauma of witnessing their civilization's death apparently hung over them. Evidence suggests the city struggled to find stability in this new reality. Its population divided between those wishing to rebuild what was lost and those believing the old ways had been fundamentally flawed. A SRAM landed near what would become H-Londith, apparently finding itself in more hospitable circumstances than many survivors. The sources suggest the land around them could sustain agriculture, and established trade routes were accessible. The people of Asram appear to have adapted more successfully than many other Netheri's refugees. Based on what we know of the region's later development, they likely integrated with local populations and worked to build something new rather than attempting to recreate the past. H-Londith descended into territory that would bear its name, becoming a ground-bound city that the sources indicate would endure for several more centuries before eventually falling to other causes. The transition from floating enclave to surface city must have been deeply unsettling for residents, particularly those born in the sky, who had never walked on natural ground until the fall. While we cannot know their specific emotional responses with certainty, the dramatic change in their circumstances would logically have required significant adaptation. The most remarkable survival story belongs to the enclave of Thultanthar, which took a desperate gamble as magic failed. The sources indicate that arcanists of Thultanthar had been studying planar magic and apparently sensed the disturbance in the weave before the complete collapse. Rather than face falling like the other enclaves, they cast a spell to shift their entire city to another plane of existence. They chose the Shadowfell, the dark mirror of the material plane, as their destination. The historical record suggests this transition was not smooth. As Thultanthar began phasing between planes and magic died, the city apparently existed partially in both worlds and fully in neither for some terrible period. The accounts describe this as agonizing for residents, though these descriptions come from sources compiled long after the events and should be viewed with appropriate caution. The transition apparently completed, and Thultanthar found itself in the Shadowfell. They had survived, but the sources indicate the price was substantial. The shadow energy of their new realm began infusing the city and its people, transforming them in fundamental ways. They became what would be known as the Shadavar, marked permanently by their flight from the fall. Thultanthar would remain in the Shadowfell for approximately 1,777 years, though the exact duration varies slightly between sources. They were isolated from the material world, developing a culture and magical tradition shaped by their shadowy realm. They would eventually return to Phaerimm, But their story during the fall is one of escape rather than survival in its aftermath. The survivors in Low Netheril faced circumstances far more dire than those in the saved enclaves. They had not been floating when magic failed, so they avoided falling. But their situation was desperate nonetheless. The desert of Anarok continued expanding, consuming more territory with each passing year. The Phaerimm, no longer facing organized Netherese resistance, apparently emerged from the Underdark to raid settlements. Food and water grew scarcer as the land died. Disease spread through cities swollen with refugees from the fallen enclaves. The migration that had been ongoing for decades became a flood. The sources indicate that entire populations abandoned their homes and fled westward. They traveled in large caravans, thousands moving together for mutual protection and support. The journey was brutal, with the desert claiming many before they could escape it. Those who reached lands beyond the wasteland often found themselves unwelcome. The peoples they encountered apparently viewed Netherese refugees with suspicion or hostility. These were survivors of an empire that had been seen as arrogant and isolationist. Now they came seeking food, shelter, and land. The sources suggest many communities turned them away. Some accepted small numbers of refugees in exchange for magical knowledge or service, but large-scale acceptance appears to have been rare. One group found sanctuary with the dwarves of Ascor, a kingdom that had maintained trade relationships with Netheril for centuries. The dwarves apparently remembered those relationships and took in refugees who reached their gates. Thousands of humans found shelter in underground halls, living alongside the dwarves under very different conditions than they had known, but in safety. Another significant group followed the archwizard Ramark, who the sources indicate had prepared for disaster. Ramark had assembled a fleet of skyships, magical vessels whose flight was independent of Mythalers, and which therefore survived the fall. He gathered followers from among surviving arcanists and their families, along with as many books and magical items as they could salvage. They departed southward toward warmer regions. Ramark's expedition eventually reached the peninsula that would become Halriwa. These Netherese established settlements that would grow into a new nation. They brought their magical knowledge, founding a society that would become known for its wizards and carefully guarded secrets. Halriwa would endure for millennia as a living remnant of Netherese magical tradition, though adapted to a very different context and shaped by awareness of what hubris had cost their ancestors. Some Netherese made the choice to flee into the Underdark, seeking refuge in the deep places despite those being the Phaerimm's realm. They descended through caves and tunnels, going deep enough to find regions where the aberrations apparently did not hunt. There, they founded settlements, including the city of Philok. Life in perpetual darkness was harsh, requiring them to grow fungi for food and defend against numerous predators. But they survived, adapting through necessity. The transformation of the land above continued inexorably. Anauroch covered almost all of what had been Netheril's heartland, where forests, rivers, farmland, and cities had existed. Now only sand and wind remained. The few settlements that persisted were isolated outposts around oases or underground water sources, surrounded by hostile emptiness. The ruins of the fallen enclaves became landmarks in the desert, monuments to the vanished age. Some had broken apart completely on impact, scattering remains across vast areas. Others survived more or less intact, creating surreal sights. Based on later accounts of the ruins, you could find towers standing alone in sand, miles from other structures, streets of buildings half buried in dunes, their windows empty. Mythalers, the great crystals that had powered entire cities, now dark and inert. Treasure hunters and adventurers began exploring these ruins, seeking magical items and lost knowledge. The sources indicate they found considerable wealth, as the Netherese had created countless artifacts, and the fallen cities contained many of them. But the ruins were also dangerous. Some were apparently haunted by spirits of those who died in the fall. Others contained guardians, magical constructs that continued defending their posts centuries after their creators had died. The desert itself was deadly, with sandstorms and extreme heat. The statue of Karsus became one of the most notable sights in the ruins. The petrified body of the Arcanist who caused the fall stood in what had been his enclave, frozen in the moment of his death. Accounts describe his stone face locked in an expression of anguish, with tears also turned to stone running down his cheeks. Those who found the statue reportedly felt overwhelming sadness in its presence, though whether this was psychological response to what the statue represented or some lingering magical effect is unclear. The wider world felt effects of the fall beyond Netheril itself. When magic died for those brief minutes, spells everywhere failed. The chaos was global, and though it lasted only a short time, consequences rippled outward for years. Some sources mention specific incidents, such as the elven nation of Alefarn facing crisis, when its guardian was forced to draw on alternate sources of magical power, and was transformed in the process. Mystra's new restrictions on magic affected arcanists throughout the world, not only Netherese survivors. The ban of Karsus meant spells above 10th level could no longer be cast by anyone, anywhere. The sources suggest many arcanists found that magic they had known for years no longer functioned properly. The goddess was reshaping the fundamental rules of magic, making it safer, but also more limited. The scattered remnants of Netheril persisted for centuries in isolated communities, maintaining their heritage, but they would never rebuild their empire. The knowledge and power that had made Netheril great was lost in the fall, scattered across a continent or buried beneath sand. The Mythalers were destroyed or depleted. The nether scrolls that had begun it all disappeared, apparently hidden away by those who recognized they were too dangerous to remain accessible. What remained was memory and warning. A cautionary tale passed down through generations about the dangers of hubris and the price of reaching too far. Section 6. Legacy Eternal. The echoes of Netheril's fall would reverberate through history for thousands of years, shaping the development of magic and civilization across Phaerimm. What occurred in the year -339 Dale reckoning changed fundamental rules governing how magic operated, and those changes would affect every spellcaster who came after. Mystra, newly ascended from Mistral sacrifice, apparently understood that such a catastrophe must never be allowed to happen again. The goddess had died because a mortal stole her power and attempted to assume a burden only divine consciousness could bear. The weave had unraveled because that mortal, despite extraordinary talent, could not maintain what she maintained. The lesson the sources suggest Mystra drew was clear. There were limits mortals must not cross, boundaries that required enforcement through divine law rather than trust. Mystra instituted what became known as the Ban of Karsus, a fundamental alteration to magic structure. No spell above the 10th level could ever again be cast by mortal hands. The 11th and 12th level magic that Karsus had pioneered, spells touching on divine power and reshaping reality at its deepest levels, were forbidden absolutely. The sources indicate that attempts to create such magic would fail, with the weave itself refusing to channel the necessary power. The goddess went further than simply banning the highest levels of magic. She also placed restrictions on certain types of spells, regardless of their level. Magic that could directly affect deities became impossible for mortals to wield. Spells that could fundamentally alter the weave were forbidden. The sources suggest that time magic, which Netherese arcanists had developed, became heavily restricted. This makes logical sense from a divine perspective. Time travel could potentially be used to prevent the fall, which would mean Mystra herself would never ascend. The timeline apparently had to be protected. The very nature of how magic functioned appears to have changed as well. The sources indicate that Netherese practiced what they called arcanist magic, apparently a system allowing them to cast spells through internalized understanding of magical principles. After the fall, magic shifted toward what became the wizard tradition, requiring careful study of spellbooks, daily preparation of specific spells, and use of material components. Magic became more structured and limited, but also safer. The flexibility that had allowed Netherese arcanists to push boundaries also made catastrophic mistakes easier. The new system Mystra established was more constrained, but those constraints served as protections. If you had been a spellcaster in the years following the fall, based on what the sources tell us about magical changes, you would have found that spells cast countless times suddenly required different approaches. Magic that had flowed naturally now required conscious effort and careful preparation. The adjustment must have been profound, though mortals adapted because adaptation is what they do. the physical scars of the fall remained visible for millennia. The desert of Anarok, created by centuries of Phaerimm life-draining magic, covered what had been Netheril's heartland. The sand swallowed the last ground-bound cities within a few centuries of the fall. Only ruins of the fallen enclaves remained visible, monuments scattered across the wasteland. These ruins became destinations for adventurers and treasure hunters throughout subsequent ages. The Netherese had created countless magical items, and the fallen cities contained many of them. A single artifact from Netheril could grant tremendous wealth or power, but the ruins were dangerous, haunted and trapped, and subject to the harsh desert environment. The statue of Karsus became perhaps the most famous and feared of all the ruins. The petrified arcanist stood in what had been his enclave, his stone face frozen in anguish. Those who found the statue reported feeling overwhelming sadness in its presence. Some claimed they heard whispers in the wind around it. A few attempted to study the statue or perhaps restore Karsus to life, but these efforts apparently came to nothing. Even if restoration were possible, Mystra presumably would never have permitted it. The goddess kept close watch on anything related to Netheril, particularly anything connected to Karsus's avatar. The spell itself was apparently erased as thoroughly as divine power could manage. Records of it were destroyed or altered beyond recognition. Those who tried to reconstruct it from fragments found their research disrupted. Based on this pattern, we can infer that Mystra had learned some knowledge was too dangerous to exist. But while the goddess could control magic, she could not control memory or ambition. The story of Netheril passed from generation to generation, told in various forms and emphasizing different aspects. Some tellings focused on the wonders achieved, the floating cities and powerful magic. Others emphasized the hubris and arrogance. Still others framed it as tragedy, the story of a brilliant man who tried to save his people and instead destroyed everything. The various groups of Netherese survivors scattered across Phaerimm kept their heritage alive in different ways. The people of Halriwa, descended from arcanists who fled south with Ramark, built a nation famous for its wizards and carefully guarded magical secrets. They studied fragments of Netherese knowledge they had preserved, but apparently did so cautiously, aware of what hubris had cost. Halriwa became powerful and prosperous, but never attempted to recreate the floating cities or push magic to Netheril's extremes. The three saved enclaves each developed their own relationship with their Netherese past, based on what fragmentary records suggest. Anoria struggled with the fall's trauma for generations, its people divided. The city eventually fell to other causes. Asram apparently integrated more successfully with surrounding peoples, allowing its distinct Netherese identity to fade gradually. Londeth maintained its culture longer, but also eventually succumbed to time and external pressures. The Netherese, who founded Philok in the Underdark, adapted to their lightless realm, and became a people apart. They developed their own traditions shaped by their hostile environment. They remembered they had once lived in floating cities, but from their perspective in eternal darkness, this must have seemed increasingly dreamlike. And in the Shadowfell, Thultanthar drifted through gray mists, its people transforming into something no longer quite human. The Shadowvar spent approximately 1,777 years in exile. They developed their own culture and magical traditions, learning to manipulate shadow in unprecedented ways. They remembered the fall and what Karsus had done, and they apparently planned for eventual return to Phaerimm. That return came in 1372 Dale Reckoning, nearly 17 centuries after the fall. The City of Shade appeared in the skies above Anarok. The Shadowvar had not forgotten their heritage or their enmity toward the Phaerimm. They had spent centuries preparing, and they announced intentions to rebuild the Netherese empire and reclaim ancestral lands. The return of Shade shocked the nations of Phaerimm. Here was a piece of ancient Netheril, preserved impossibly across millennia, returned with its power and ambition intact. The Shadowvar were led by princes who had been alive during the fall, arcanists who had witnessed their civilization's death and spent nearly 2,000 years planning its restoration. The sources indicate that the Shadowvar achieved much in the years following their return. They waged war against the Phaerimm, apparently succeeding in driving the creatures back significantly, if not destroying them entirely. They reclaimed portions of Anarok, using powerful magic to restore life to lands that had been desert for millennia. They established themselves as a major power, their floating city a symbol of their connection to ancient glories. But they too would eventually fall. The sources indicate that in 1491 Dale Reckoning, the City of Shade was destroyed, crashed into ruins of the ancient elven city of Myth-Draenor. The impact killed thousands of Shadowvar and scattered their forces. Thultanthar, which had survived the Fall of Netheril by fleeing to another plane and endured nearly 2,000 years of exile, was finally destroyed. The last of the floating cities was gone. The lesson of Netheril, it seems, was one that required repeated learning. Power, no matter how great, could not overcome fundamental limits of mortal existence. Ambition, no matter how grand, could not substitute for wisdom. Magic, no matter how sophisticated, carried potential for catastrophe if wielded without restraint. The Forgotten Realms in later eras bears Netheril's mark in countless ways, though few think about it consciously. Every restriction on magic, every spell that cannot be cast, every limitation that frustrates ambitious wizards exists because of what Karsus did. Every time a mage studies a spellbook and prepares magic for the day, they work within the system Mystra created to prevent another fall. The desert of Anarok, though somewhat restored by Shadowvar efforts before their destruction, still covers vast territories and holds ruins beneath its sands. And beneath it all, in the deepest parts of the earth, the Phaerimm apparently endure. They were driven back by the Netherils, weakened by the Shadowvar, but never fully destroyed according to the sources. They wait in the darkness, and perhaps they remember the empire that fought them, the civilization that built cities in the sky and believed itself invincible. The story of Netheril is more than history. It serves as warning and reminder. It speaks to the heights mortals can reach through dedication and genius, but also to the depths they can fall through pride and overreach. It demonstrates that there are limits existing for good reason, that some boundaries should not be crossed, no matter how tempting. It teaches that power without wisdom is not strength, but danger, and that the greatest achievements can become the greatest catastrophes through a single moment of hubris. When you consider questions of magic or power or ambition, remember Netheril. Remember the floating cities that touched the clouds. Remember the arcanists who believed they could do anything. Remember Karsus, who reached for divinity and brought down an empire. Remember that every choice has consequences, and some consequences echo through millennia. The Fall of Netheril ended an age of wonders, but it also taught lessons that shaped every age following. Those lessons remain relevant, as vital now as they were 3,000 years ago. Power demands responsibility. Knowledge requires wisdom, and there are some heights from which the only possible direction is down. If you found this exploration of one of the darkest moments in Phaerimm's history enlightening, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. There are countless other stories from the Forgotten Realms waiting to be told, other civilizations that rose and fell, other moments when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Until next time, may your studies be fruitful, your magic be stable, and your ambitions be tempered with wisdom.